Thanks very much, Greg, and thank you to all our listeners online coming along today to listen to our webinar about breeding values, your tool for looking under the hood of your next sire. So this webinar basically is for those that are open to using breeding values and are wanting to dip their toe into getting a bit more knowledge to implement the use of breeding values in selecting bulls to bring into their herd. So if we think about why breeding values matter, we're going to talk a little bit about what influences an animal's performance and how we can then look under the hood of those animals and really find out what are some of the key traits and genetics and how we can bring those into our cow herds. So if we're thinking about what has influenced what a bull looks like on sale day, what has influenced his performance up until that point in time, there are a number of factors that we need to consider. So feed, both quantity and quality, how do we fairly compare if bulls have been treated differently, especially if we're at a multi-vendor sale, for example. So if we have two bulls that are side by side and one's been fed on a high grain diet and the other one's just been out running on an average paddock with lower quality, the one on the grain-fed diet is obviously going to be heavier, but this isn't going to be passed on to his progeny. It's just a matter of how those animals have been managed up until that point of time. The other thing that impacts an animal's performance is the age of the bull. So older bulls in the draft will be heavier, especially because they've had a longer time to mature and grow. But this difference is not going to be passed on to their progeny. Also, the dam age, the age of the mother is going to impact the bull's performance. A 6-year-old cow is going to produce a heavier calf compared to a 2-year-old heifer because she's more experienced, she knows what she's doing. But again, this difference won't be passed on. And then lastly, if we think about disease and parasites, that's going to have an impact on those bulls. So an animal that's not been able to fully grow out because he's been impacted by disease or parasites is not going to look as big or as good a quality as a bull that has had a smooth run up until the sale. So there are a lot of non-genetic or environmental factors that influence an animal's performance, but none of these are going to be passed on to the progeny in our herd. The only bit that we are really interested in is the genes that animal carries. So estimated breeding values, or EBVs, give us a best estimate of the genes that animal carries and takes out as much of the environmental factors as we possibly can. In saying that though, we have to remember that the basics haven't changed, that we also need to make sure we structurally assess those bulls and for structural soundness and for morphology, so that when we take those bulls home, they're actually going to be able to deliver those genetics out into our cow herd. So that's just as important as making sure we dig down and look at the genetics that bull carries. So many of the profit drivers that we're interested in, we cannot visually see. So we actually need some way to look under the hood of those animals and really interrogate what it is that what the genes are that they're carrying and what they're going to bring home into our cow herd. So I like to think about this as a bit of an analogy of buying a car. So we can see that, you know, lots of cars have lots of different physical features, but looks alone don't tell us about some of the things that are under the bonnet. You know, we need to think about what's the engine size, what's the towing capacity, the torque power of the car, how many gears does it have, and even more importantly, what's the fuel economy of that car, how efficient is it going to be? And then we can also go one step further to that, is we've interrogated, we looked at all that information, but we really want to know whether it suits our environment or not. So there's places like, or reviewers like Pat Callanan that take those cars out and test them in the same environment to work out which car is better. So, you know, we might be looking for a workhorse, for example, so we're interested in a Hilux, or we might be looking at a highway car, for example, so we go more down looking at an Amarok. It's the exact same thing when it comes to livestock. There are many traits that impact profit, and not all of them we can see. So we use breeding values to compare those animals for those traits we're interested in, and look at what will be passed on to the progeny. And we do that so we can remove the impact of all those non-genetic factors that we talked about, so we know exactly what the genes are that we're buying to bring home into our cow herd. So many of our profit drivers we can't see, and we need some form of information to help us identify what those genes are and what we're bringing home into our herd, and that's what breeding values are for. So now we know that breeding values help us remove non-genetic factors and that impact the way a bull looks on sale day. So the next step is we know why we need them, but now how can we use breeding values to help us with the bulls that we're going to buy? So an estimated breeding value is essentially made up of whole heaps of pieces of different information that's collected by your stud breeder or your seed stock breeder. So they'll take information on the own performance of that animal, record information on that animal itself. They'll also, through pedigree, look at the performance of and record information on their sires and their dams. And then we also take into account information based on the siblings. So through pedigree, we know about those that are related to each other. We look at their information as well. We also look at information based on correlated traits. So these are traits that are related to each other. We can use that information to help us inform about traits that we don't know or have any performance information recorded on. But we can also use that information to identify animals that break those relationships and are really good for two traits that we normally wouldn't expect them to be good at. We also look at, in most of our main beef analyses now, we look at DNA information, where we take a DNA test on those animals and we use that information to look at the relationships between different animals and their performance. Then we also collect certain pieces of information that allow us to take away those fixed effects and account for the different environments those animals are raised. So we can actually compare animals that are born in New South Wales, for example, to animals that are born in Western Australia. And then we also look at the heritability of a trait. So that's how much of what we see is actually due to genetics versus the environment. We know some traits are passed on easier than others, so we look at that information as well. And we combine all of that information together to then produce an EBV on an animal. So we can see these EBVs on animals basically from birth, and we only report EBVs if they meet our reporting threshold. So we do have to have some information to allow us to report those. And so if we have a young bull, for example, we can see information on them, but if we have an old bull, we can also see information on those bulls. And it just means that as they get older, we get more and more information and the EBV becomes more accurate. In beef, at the moment, EBVs are only comparable within a breed, but we can certainly compare animals that are across different environments. So in our breed plan analyses, we have lots of different traits that are available. So we have fertility traits like days to calving, for example. We have calving ease traits, growth traits like 400-day weight, carcass traits for intramuscular fat, for example, and we also look at temperament, so flight speed in the north and docility in the south. And so all these EBVs are available that predict our profit drivers and also some of the things that are our cost to production. One of the important things to note is negative EBVs are not a bad thing either. So depending on the trait, take days to calving, for example, we want to reduce the amount of days between calving events so cows get back in calf every year. So that breeding value is actually going to be, we want it to be more negative. So each of these traits are all recorded, expressed in the units that they're actually measured in, like kilograms for weight. And when we want to select for these traits, we want to think about how they fit in our production system and select for them in the desired direction. So here I have just a small example to talk through some of these key points. So we've got here 400-day weight, and I took this information out of the Brahman breed plan analysis. So firstly, we just want to look at bull A. So what I've got here is bull A's EBV is plus 36. So it's not going to be reported in what we actually measure, but it's going to be reported in a deviation from 0. So every analysis has a point where they set the base at 0. But what happens over time is our genetics get better and better, which means our average actually changes. So here we've got breed average on the bottom, and we can see bull A is 10 kilos heavier than the average for 400-day weight. Now, to make that less confusing, what we present is what we call a percentile. So the 50th percentile is the middle of the current year drop of calves in that analysis, and we can see that this particular bull is in the top 15% for that EBV. So sitting well in the top portion of the analysis. If we look at bull B on the percentile, he's in the 60th percentile, so he's actually sitting below the middle of the analysis, or below the average, which means that's a quick way we can actually see where those animals sit in comparison to the rest of the animals in that current year drop of calves in the analysis. But if we're at a sale and we actually want to look at the difference between two bulls, we can also look at the difference between bull A and bull B. So here we've got, they have a difference of 12 kilograms. But the next part is that we actually need to, they only pass on half of their genetics to their progeny, because the other half comes from the mum. And so we divide that by 2, and we can say that bull A will have on average progeny that are 6 kilos heavier than progeny from bull B. The other thing to note here is I've also got accuracy. So accuracy doesn't refer to have I got a 50-50 chance that this is what I'm going to get. It's simply a reflection of how much information is going into the calculation of that breeding value. So if most animals that have are young 2-year-old bulls that we're looking at buying, they've got information on themselves and their parents, and possibly some information on their siblings, we expect the accuracy to be around 60%. As that animal becomes a bull and they get progeny information, then their accuracy gets up around the 80% mark. So on average, we're looking at, you know, young bulls having information around 60%, but is also dependent on the type of trait that we're looking at. So now that we know about breeding values and there's all these traits available, how do we actually know which ones to look at when we're bringing those, when we're going to try and find a bull to bring into our herd? So the first thing, or the best thing to do, is to design a breeding objective. And when we do that, there are 4 key things that we need to think about. So the first one is being, what is the environment that we're operating in? Are we in the northern Australia, where we have climate variability and tick resistance may be a concern, or are we in a high rainfall area, for example? And then we also need to think about what is our target market. So are we supplying steers to the live trade? Are we sending, growing out steers and sending them direct to an abattoir, or are we supplying into a feedlot? And then to help us think about where we sit, we need to look at our current herd performance. So, you know, are we meeting our compliance if we're sending to straight to the abattoir, or are we, can we improve what's our current MSA index, or what's my weaning percentage on farm? And even if we have the information, we can look at what's our kilograms of beef per hectare. And we can look at that at our own performance point of view, but we can also look at industry information to see where we sit in comparison to the rest of industry as well. And then lastly, we need to think about what are our profit drivers. So what are the things that are making us income, but then also what are the things that are a cost to production as well, and how can we potentially control some of those when we're thinking about which bulls we're going to buy. So now that we know where our business actually sits, we can link what our business needs to the genetics that we can go out and find. So I like to think about this as what are our production traits, and then what are our EBV selection traits. So we might pick that our production traits are weaning percentage, steer turn-off weight, and MSA index, for example. And then if I match those up to what the EBV selection traits are, we could select for days to calving, 600-day weight, and intramuscular fat. Now, that's a lot of traits to look at if we're trying to sort through lots and lots of bulls. So we can also use indexes. So each of the breeds have breed-specific indexes that have been produced around a standard production system. So looking at systems where we're either self-replacing, or that we're a terminal production system where we send everything to slaughter. And those production systems take into account a lot of different traits, both relating to our profit drivers and our cost of production. And they weight all those things together so that when we select using those indexes, we can improve lots of different traits at the same time. So when you select your EBV selection traits, you can also use that to match to an index that might be able to help you narrow down which bulls to buy. So if you have a draft of 900 bulls in a sale, a multi-vendor sale, you can use that index to narrow down to the top 40 or top 30, and then you can use your individual EBVs to narrow it down further than there. So if I was looking for an animal that I needed high growth, I was turning off straight to slaughter, and I really wanted to improve my meat eating quality, these are some of the traits that I could be looking at. So matching production traits with EBVs is a key step to helping find the right bulls for you. So writing a breeding objective really is helpful to help you work out which breeding values to use when you go out to have a look at buying a bull and bringing it back into your herd. Okay, so now that we've heard about breeding values and developing a breeding objective, I'd now like to invite Clara Knudsen to join me on this webinar. As you heard from Greg, Clara is a beef producer from Queensland, and she's here to share some of her experiences with using breeding values in a herd. The Knudsens have been using EBVs for about 15 years and have witnessed firsthand the difference breeding values have made in their herd. I won't steal Cara's thunder, so we'll kick straight into the first question. Cara, can you tell us about the enterprise that you and your husband Darcy operate in Queensland?
Thanks, Clara. Thanks for having me here today. Yes, we are really from Mandubra, which is west of Bundaberg, and we started there on the family property, and we run a breeding operation which is predominantly Santa Gertrudis cows now, and we do some crossbreeding, and we also have a percentage of cattle that we just are trading, so they're just going through to a feedlot weight. And then our main site is at Hewenden in North Queensland, west of Townsville. So up there we have both breeders and trading, and I'd like to say they're all Sanders, but we had to completely destock during the drought. So we purchased cows back in over the last few years, and they're predominantly all sorts, although we are making them into a more even line. So I suppose that's something that everyone battles with, is trying to keep all their breeders and which ones to get rid of, and then having to start with not the ideal situation. So that's probably where we're at with and who we are.
Yeah, thanks, Clara. So why did you get started with breeding values and using genetics in your selection decisions?
We have always been really interested in genetics and found how, you know, genetics in our herd quite fascinating. And we were trying to use EBVs. We'd read about them. We didn't really know how they were used. And so probably we're not getting the full value out of what we were doing with our bulls, and the money that we were spending on bulls. We really felt we needed to know more. And we went to a breeding edge workshop, which had been going back more than 10 years now. It was they'd only been going a very short time. And that really got us a really sound understanding of what breeding EBVs were. And we just used them without, we stopped buying bulls any other way. If they didn't have EBVs, we didn't buy bulls. And we really started to look at what our cow herd was, and then we went to sort of putting in some breeding objectives and really defining what we wanted to achieve and where we were at. And then we went looking for bulls that had the right EBVs to try and put us where we wanted to be.
Yeah, so that's great to hear, Clara. And so when you're selecting those bulls, what parts do phenotype and breeding values play in that decision making?
So both still very important. We really regard structural soundness as being extremely important. So it's probably the last on the list in terms of what we look at, because we look at the EBVs before we go to the sale. So we've done our homework on the EBVs before we attend, whether it's a field day or an open day, or we buy bulls in the paddock. We've really hunted down which EBVs we're after. So for us, we're looking for fertility. So we're looking at those days to calving, and we're looking at the fact that in the stud that we're looking at, that they mate as yearlings, because that's what we're doing. If we can get gestational length, we like to see that as well, but that's not as well known in the Santa and some of the other tropical breeds. And then we're looking for growth EBVs. So we want good 200 and 400 day growth. We're less concerned about a 600-day growth, because by that time nowadays in our operation, they're generally through to the feedlot by then. And we're also looking for a moderate mature cow weight. So we really worked on our cows that were really big and trying to bring that down to a much more moderate frame because of nutrition and fertility and the likes.
Yeah, so you've mentioned what traits you're selecting for, and that's close to your breeding objective. So how did you come up with your breeding objective, and what pieces of information did you look for?
Well, when we were doing our breeding objective, and it does change as well, I'd like to add that it does change over time. When you look back, you achieve what you thought about 5 years ago, and now our objective has shifted. So 5 years ago, we wanted a predominantly polled herd. That was something that was important to us, but we were not prepared to forsake any of the other traits. So we didn't want to be duped on fertility or growth. So we looked at our cows, and we thought that they were too big. We also thought that they were too late a maturing, so they weren't they weren't getting in calf early enough. So we wrote all the things down that we didn't like about our herd, I suppose, or that we thought needed improving. And then we put against those where we wanted to be in 5 years. So that was that we wanted to be, 70 or 80% polled, that we wanted to have highly fertile yearlings, and that we could turn off feedlot weight at 12 to 18 months of age, so that we were getting them up to that 450 kilos as early as possible. There's also other factors around nutrition and trying to get the right nutrition to get them there as well, but that's how we really set our objectives. And then from there we went and looked for the EBVs and the traits that allowed us to do that.
Yeah, so it's really a reevaluating it every step along the way. So I guess, Clara, can you describe your herd before you started using breeding values to where it is now?
So, well, exactly with the polled, we probably had about 95% of our herd probably more than 5 years ago, let's say 8 years ago, was horned. So they were nearly all horned. And this year when we branded, we had less than 15% had horns. So, so now we feel like we've met that objective. That's acceptable. We will continue to accept that some will have horns, and we will continue to pursue genetics that are polled, but we also acknowledge that we might have to buy some bulls that have horns, because we might not get all of the traits that we have in polled, but we aim to keep it around that 15%. So we've achieved that. Probably 10 years ago, if we were mating all our yearling heifers, we would be lucky to get 20% in calf. Now, part of that was nutrition as well. We also had to look after them much better. But last year we got 78% in calf, and this year we got about 60% in calf of yearling heifers. Now, it was back this year, but it was also extremely dry through till February, March. So we still consider that that's fairly good for our type of country and from where we've started. So they're two things that we feel that we've achieved. Now we've also definitely achieved a decrease in our mature cow weight. So it's hard to know exactly how much we've brought that down, but possibly by 100 kilos. So now we're looking at, well, can we, what's our next problem? Well, now our cows aren't as fertile, on a repeat breed. So we're still struggling with that. So we're continuing to look at bulls that are more fertile with days to calving and gestation length. So that's where I suppose our next 5 years is pushing that.
Yeah, so there's some really great results to hear, and you've made some significant progress, which is really good to see. So I guess my last question for you, Clara, is what advice do you have for producers who are unsure about using breeding values when selecting sires?
Well, I think it is very daunting when you start out, because it does sort of look like a foreign language to start with. So go along to studs that you trust and that do have EBVs, and try and go to their field day or sidle up to them and get an understanding of EBVs, and then go to somebody else and ask a lot of questions. I think there's no silly questions, so it's just really about starting. And also it's about at the end of the day, we're all entitled to some mistakes, and we've probably made plenty, and we've often purchased bulls in the past that we thought were fantastic and had really high growth, and then we've lost some fertility to those bulls. And so we've learnt from that experience, and we now hold the days to calving and gestation length in much higher regard, and we're starting to remove that problem from our herd. So I don't think, I don't want to make it sound like it's so easy and that we don't make mistakes because now we've got EBVs, but it's about educating yourself and trying to take as many of the mistakes out as possible.
Yeah, that's some really great advice there, Clara. And look, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights with our listeners. We're just going to go through the last section of the presentation, and then we'll have time for questions for Clara and myself at the end. So thank you very much, Clara.
No problem.
So now that we've heard Clara share some of her insights with us, and we've learnt about how we can introduce breeding values into our herd, now what are the next steps from here, and where can we find out some more information? So Meat and Livestock Australia have developed a new one-stop shop genetics shop. We have a new website that's going to be available at the end of June. And this website is going to house a whole range of new resources. Firstly, it's going to share with you some producers' case studies similar to listening to Cara's story. And it's also going to have a raft of new how-to videos walking through what is an EBV, how do I develop a breeding objective, what is an index. So there's a whole range of new resources that are going to be housed on this website. The URL is genetics.mla.com.au, and it will be available at the end of June for you to look at your leisure. So it'll be split into four categories: tropical cattle, temperate cattle, prime lamb and merino. So when you first get to the website, you'll be able to select the area that most suits your type of operation. There's also lots of short courses and other resources that are available as well. So there's Bred Well, Fed Well courses. They're a one-day course that go through half-day genetics, half-day nutrition. And these run for both beef and sheep in Northern Australia and Southern Australia. There are also breeding edge workshops. So these are 3-day workshops that go into a lot more detail and help go through the whole process of designing a breeding objective and helping you achieve what you want to in your breeding operation, in your herd, and really walk through the ins and outs of genetics. And then we also have 2 extension services. So there's Tropical Beef Technology Services, or TBTS, in Northern Australia, and they have a commercial representative, which is Tim Emery, and they also have a seed stock representative, which is Paul Williams. And then there's also Southern Beef Technology Services that look after all of our southern breeds, and that's Boyd Goodo and Katrina Millen that look after those as well. So please get in contact with those people if you have any direct questions, or if you would like to run a workshop. There's certainly a good resource to have any questions that you may have around genetics. So the last section that I have is just a quick sneak peek into what our next webinar that's coming in the next couple of months will be about, which is how we go about selecting a high-performing sire. So when we're looking at bringing a sire in, there are lots of different things that we need to consider. So here's a few quick steps of how we can go about that process. So the first thing is to make sure that we do our homework. There's a whole raft of information that's available, not only on EBVs, but also what's been recorded on that herd. We can also contact the seed stock producer and ask some questions about what they're recording, find out if they are yearling mating, for example. And we can use that information to help us create a shortlist. So again, if we're looking at a raft of 900 bulls, we can actually narrow that down to a shorter number that we're going to look at on sale day. And then when we get to the sale, that's when our skills come into hand. We can go and look at all of those animals that are on our short list and work out which ones are going to meet our structural requirements, and make sure that they're actually going to be able to deliver those genetics to our herd. And then once we actually make a purchase, we need to make sure we record some basic information like brand and management tag that helps us remember where we purchased the bull from, but also the management tag number helps us identify that bull if we want to find out more information on it as it comes to hand. We record our animal movement records such as LPA, National Vendor Declaration, and any other relevant information that we require. And then lastly, we need to make sure that when we get that bull home, we actually take good care of it so it can deliver those genetics as we required. So keeping an eye on its condition, its health, behavior, and making sure that we are supplying it with good nutrition so it can go out and do its job. So the key point of that webinar is that there are lots of different things that we're going to need to look at in terms of when we're going to purchase a sire. But the key thing to remember in relation to that is to do your homework before you're going to the sale. So breeding values, they're your tool for looking under the hood of your next sire. They're there to help you remove the non-genetic factors that impact the way a bull looks on sale day and really look under the hood. It's important to write a breeding objective because that helps you work out which breeding values to use, what's important for your production system. And then it's also really important to make sure that we do our homework before we go to the sale. So this is a tagline that you will see used in a whole range of new communications that MLA will be releasing to promote the new website and resources that have been developed to help producers to get started with using breeding values. And this will have a raft of case studies and a raft of how-to videos associated with it, and that content will be updated over time. So that's going to be live at the end of this month at genetics.mla.com.au. And so keep an eye out for our next webinar in the future to be delivered on how to shop for a high-performing sire. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll pass it back to Greg.